Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's seminar. My name is David Dubashi. I'm a professor in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering in the Data Science and AI Division. And I'm one of the co-organizers of this series, together with my colleagues, Fredrik Johansson, Umberto Piccini, and Fredrik Karl. AI Talks is a seminar series. It's a flagship event of CHAIR, which is the Chalmers AI Research Center. And our goal is to bring some of the world's most distinguished researchers in AI and machine learning to Chalmers. We were, of course, planning to do this in person, but unfortunately, due to the COVID situation, we are forced at the moment to run this online. But let's hope that in the near future, we will be able to have these people in person here at Chalmers. So today's talk is for one of these distinguished researchers in an area which has seen some of the most dramatic impact of AI and machine learning, which is natural language technologies. And to tell you, give you a short introduction to today's speaker and the area, I'll hand over to my colleague, Richard Johansson, who has known our speaker for many years in the past.
So as David mentioned, Barbara's research in general is in the field of building machine learning models for processing language, natural language, and specifically her research focuses on the mismatch between the data that we use to train machine learning models and the data distribution in the scenario where we will apply a system that we have developed using machine learning. So for instance, in language processing applications, it may be quite common that we train on, let's say, news text, but in practice, we might want to apply a system for processing scientific text or social media or something, and then there is a mismatch. There is also a mismatch between languages because maybe we have data in English, but we want to deploy the system to analyze Swedish or some other language. So these types of mismatch are the types of research problem that Barbara's research focuses on and what we can do about them. So Barbara is an associate professor at the University of Copenhagen, and during her career, she has received a number of best paper awards and a number of research grants, including recently one research leader grant from the Danish Research Fund, and an Amazon Research Award. So now I will hand over to Barbara.
Yes, welcome everybody. Can you hear me? Yes. All right, so thanks a lot, Devdat and Richard, for the introduction. I would, of course, wish to be there present and see you all. I have met some of you, but not all, so I'm looking forward to do that in future. And thanks a lot for this invitation. So great introduction, because Richard already laid out kind of the broad themes that I will talk cover in this talk. But just to give you a rough overview of what I have thought about the structure of this talk is I will first go back to the roots and to introduce you to the field. What is NLP? What are we doing essentially? And where are the big problems? And then zoom into specific applications in this broad area of working under these mismatches, or what I typically can call also adverse conditions. So this is the plan, and I will try to stop after each of the parts. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, at the end. And yeah, okay. So let's go. All right. So if you think about machine learning or AI and NLP in particular, that field is really caring about language understanding. And so what we here really want to do is to build models or technology that, on the one side, understands language, understands text, but also produces text, right? And in my research area, I focus a lot on the understanding part, but there is a huge subfield also on natural language generation for language production. And if you think now for a second, think about a movie or some technology where you came across NLP, you probably, something pops into your mind. And if I were there, I would ask you, but maybe I just show you a couple of examples on where we could go in future. So we are essentially here as a couple of fictive NLP technologies where we find in our movies. But if you think about them, And maybe some of you have experience with some of those tools. So there is still quite a bit of a gap, right? The field has developed tremendously, and we do have this technology now in our living rooms, etc. But there is still a lot to be done. But this is kind of showing where we could potentially hope to go, but hopefully with some good agents, not like HEL in HEL 9000. All right, so to give you a broad idea of some of the, so this is like one application, this voice assistant and understanding the language in there, but we are really often interested in a variety of more smaller tasks that help us in the end to understand language. So take for instance, this example, I like Vince Gilligan, and we might be interested in a diverse range of tasks to understand this sentence. So from really tagging what are the word classes, up to more what is the syntactic structure or the chunks that we can find in the sentence, up to even, you know, maybe key entities and what's called named entities, or we might be interested in what's conveyed through the message, like sentiment, or finding out properties about the speaker behind this sentence. So for instance, there's a female now talking to you above 30. But if you look now back, so this gives an example of kind of the problems we are dealing with often, but how has this field developed and where are we now? And that's why, so very, very like a summary in 2 slides on the history of NLP is there was like 3 revolutions, you could say. And the first was very much focused on symbolic AI and rule-based approaches to develop systems. Some of you might know the LISA system. But then there was a big jump in, hey, we can actually create corpora and annotate them, and then use machine learning or statistical NLP approaches to learn from these annotations. And this has really a lot. And here the questions were mostly about how can I now actually take this sentence and these labels from one of the tasks we have seen before, and how can I represent this instance in the computer? And that was more about, you know, here the dog barks, what are the properties of the words and how do we put them into the machine learning system, and how do we break down this sequence into smaller pieces that we can handle it. So this was the statistical NLP world. This dominated the field, so I grew up in this area essentially. But then in like a couple of years ago, there came really this revolution, which we have seen in several other fields like speech and image, computer vision much earlier. But if you look at NLP, it was around 2015 where really what Chris Manning, one of the big leaders in the field, termed the tsunami of deep learning hit the field. And now the big jump there was essentially to go away from this, thinking about the features and handcrafting a lot, to learning representations. Some of this was already there, but it wasn't scaling up that well. And there were new ways to learn representation that made it a whole other world, essentially. So now we are talking all about embeddings and these dense representations. And just to give you a little bit of a flavor of what they are, and a lot of the central technology is based on these word representation, what's called word embeddings, where we map these word types now into a high-dimensional space, so that we are going away from these and-hot encodings to dense representations, where you can also find things which are more close to each other. And why is this helpful? Because this can, help us to go beyond this problem of language is constantly changing. It's something that there's new words coined every day. We want to model phenomena which are really, really not very frequent, but sometimes very important to get right. And so this is a way that helps us overcome this sparsity problem as well. But in recent years, there was this was really powerful, but there was one trait or one property which made this work to a certain extent only. And this was, in a nutshell, that for the same word in different contexts, you would always use the same kind of word representation. So it wasn't depending on the context in which this word was used. So that's why these embeddings or word embeddings before 2018 essentially were called the static representations. And so if we look at this third revolution, you might think, hey, there was actually a little revolution in this deep learning revolution itself. And this is really in the last years, there was a key idea of going away from the static representation to dynamic or contextualized representations, where now the word representation, or you can take it for longer, word parts, phrases, sentences, documents, are now contextualized. And I give you just a flavor of one of them. I'm pretty sure all of you have heard about it, but one of the first was ELMO, and ELMO means embedding as language models. And if you now go back to this problem of seeing this word ducks in some context, the main idea was now we have at this time we had LSTMs, and we are running essentially a big, deep LSTM network and try to predict the next word. So we are building a simple language model that predicts the next token, but now run it in a way that we look at both left and right contexts and create a representation that depends now on the context of the words around it. And this is essentially what's driving now these new models, where instead of LSTMs, we have moved forward to transformers. Instead of language models predicting the next token, we moved to other objectives like masking a token or even combining multiple objectives. But this is kind of a summary in a snapshot how the field has evolved. So this is really brought huge advances in the field, and we'll touch up on this a little bit later, but still there are a lot of fundamental challenges that remain, and those are some which I would like to address in the rest of the talk. And in particular, one is in fact that often, while we have these big transformer models, if you now take language technology and you want to solve a specific problem, apply it to some application domain, you often, really often have only very little data to train on. And so while you look at this huge potential of language data out there, so in a way, we are very happy to have really a lot of data potentially available compared to other fields like medical, computer vision is an example where it's really hard to get data, but we can potentially get a lot of data, but we have very little labeled data, and it's a challenge to use this universe of data to transfer models to the application. In particular, what is in fact also a problem is in lots of cases, we have very specific type of labeled data at hand, and this is what Richard was also introducing. Maybe we have only newswire, but we want to go to another kind of textual domain, and how do we go about this problem? But I want to introduce to kind of a bigger problem or idea in this space. If you think about data in general, in machine learning, often we think only about the algorithm, right? And we want to improve the algorithm, but the data is kind of secondary. But I think it's very important to think about the data itself as well, and what is even like we use this term domain. What does it constitute? It's there is one idea was what I call variety space. It's kind of, if you have a data set, it's like a subsample of a high dimensional space, and each of the instances is an instance in a dot in the space, and we don't know the underlying dimensions of the space. We can just, sometimes we say the topic or genre is like a factor, but there's work also on attributes and how gender and demographic impacts our technology. Or you can go to language and see this is another space, but it's kind of not even, this is even a simplification of what's really going on. And there is recent work now on, in fact, taking up on and looking more at the data side of things. And this is an example where they asked, in these big transformer models like BERT nowadays, what is actually captured? And the question is, are these kind of domains in there, even though you don't explicitly train for them? And the answer is, yeah, it seems so, at least for these sample of 5 domains that are illustrated here, where they encode the data and saw that the data by itself already partitions the space to some degree, and they leverage this in neural machine translation, for example. But these are like, dimensions of variation, and cross-domain is one example, but cross-lingual is really another example, which perhaps we can even see as like a more extreme case of transfer, because the whole vocabulary might change if you go really from very distant languages. And these are the kind of questions I'm interested in my research. Just to show you a little bit back to the voice assistants I've introduced in the beginning. I was wondering now, we're also collaborating a bit with Amazon, and I was interested. Here is a very simplistic graph of the languages, or plot about the languages in Europe. And what do these these voice assistants today actually cover? And what we see here is that this coverage increased quite a bit, but there is still a lot to be done to cover, so for instance, the eastern part of Europe, or even if we zoom into, I'm somewhere in the middle from in the south of Austria, in Italy. So there's lots of like variations, dialects around in these areas where we also don't have much coverage around today. So in the long term, I hope we will get more to cover much more languages, but also varieties of languages and even varieties of domains in those languages. And so what to do about this well, the idea behind it is in general to move away from this normal or the typical traditional machine learning setup where you have a model and you train and evaluate it on a given task, on a given language, or on a living domain. And instead you want to focus on, hey, how can I actually use the knowledge that I've obtained from one model to gain better understanding of the second model. And this is an outline of the rest of the talk, essentially. I'm interested in transfer learning, adaptation, and there might be, if you're still working on the same task, this dimension that we talked about, dimension of language versus domains. But if you work on trying to leverage other task information, then there's other approaches like multitask learning, or if they don't come in, the data doesn't come in at the same time, you might face a continual learning problem that you want to adapt your system over time. And in the rest of the talk, I had to go and make a selection. So we'll focus on these first three parts and give you essentially an example of some work we have been doing in each of these boxes. Does this sound okay? Yes, all right. I see some hands up. Great. All right, then let's move into the first problem. And after that, I will take also questions. All right, so this is work with Sebastian Ruder, sometime back by now, but what we were interested in essentially this problem of how can we select data which is better for a certain application or target task. And in here, so more concretely, what does it mean? Imagine you want to do sentiment now, sentiment analysis, and you're interested in, say, kitchen appliances, and you want to build this good sentiment classifier there. You might have data from diverse source domains like books, DVDs, electronics. Now the question is, how do you best transfer to this new target domain? And we took a little bit an approach where we say, okay, we can actually assume either that we know that, in each of these book, DVD, electronics, that we have instances that we can take for training. That's the setup here. But so we can either take those source domains, the categories per se, or we can say, hey, we are actually throwing them all into a basket. Like each instance is an apple, and we want to find the best training instances of this pool or set of apples to train from. So the question is, how can we select the most relevant training data for this target domain? And why? So now you would think, why is this interesting? I have data from 3 domains. Why do I not just take all of it, right? And in fact, the answer to this is, well, often it's the case that if you train on all the data, you get actually a negative transfer, not a positive transfer from all the data that there is. And to give you just an example from the sentiment domain, you might find like predictable is a very good word for, an electronic appliance. But if you find a book with a story which is predictable, that's actually towards a negative sentiment. So they don't transfer always in the same direction. So we want to prevent this negative transfer. That was one motivation. But there was prior work on this, including my own. And it was mostly focused on using a simple similarity metric in isolation. So you take a representation, you measure distance, and then select your data and train on that. And we wanted to see, can we go beyond that by using a Bayesian optimization approach where we have the possibility to actually include different notions of similarity or even dissimilarity in this space. And by using this kind of method, also learn weights on top of the data selection representation. So we are seeing, weighting the different features. So features now are in distance function representations, and we learn how to weight them in order to find the best data. So as a setup, we have, say now, a pool of n apples, and we are interested in learning essentially a selection policy over this set of apples, and we want to learn weights for them, where each of these features for the sentence is essentially a representation of similarity, for instance. And then this gives us a re-ranking of the, or resorting of the examples, and we take the top M in order to train the system. All right, so Bayesian optimization then is essentially needing a little bit of development data, and it tries to estimate this weight policy by doing essentially a little bit of task model training. You're evaluating it, and in this way you're exploring this parameter space in order to find a good weighting that gives you a good ranking over the data essentially. And the question now remains, how do you represent your data? How do you say this instance is more similar to another one in the target? Here you can use what has been done earlier is simple, the word distribution of words, for instance, and you just measure how close they are with like Jensen-Shannon divergence. And that turned out to be a very good, simple metric in earlier work as well. So we just started from that and enriched it with various representations like topic models or word embeddings, static word embeddings back then, and different similarity functions. And in addition, we also add diversity measures. So for instance, what's the type token ratio, which gives you an indication of how many new words are used in the sentence, for instance. All right, so prior work also studied this problem for just one of the NLP tasks. So we extended it to look at sentiment analysis, in particular using this Amazon review data set. And then also 2 syntactic tasks. One was finding the word classes, part of speech tagging, and also dependency parsing, where we are after finding the structure of the sentence. And we had for these 2 tasks, we had 4 domains in the sentiment case, and we had 6 domains in the part of speech tagging and dependency parsing case. And now, in a nutshell, what we found is, okay, what can you do as a baseline? And as a baseline now, imagine we are taking over 2,000 samples from a pool of 6,000, we just randomly sample over them. We can then compare it to a single metric, right? So Jensen-Shannon, for instance, was found to be the best metric over term distributions. And now we can actually, those are the green and the yellow bars. We can use it in 2 ways. One is we are selecting the closest domain. Say, if I go to electronics, I want to go to the DVD domain and fetch examples from there. Or we disregard these domain distinctions and essentially change or select from the examples themselves. And that's the green bar. And what we saw is here, this metric alone sometimes helps, not super convincingly, but overall the yellow bars are higher than the green ones, meaning that in the sentiment case, finding the best domain category and sampling from there is better than overall. And in the Bayesian optimization case, we then saw that using the similarity or diversity metrics help us find better data. The best is to use both of these types of features, and we could get an improvement for sentiment analysis in this case. What we also see is that when you just bundle all the data together in this case, this is these green bars, then you actually do often worse than a random sample. So you really have a lot of negative transfer happening in this case. And I'm going over the dependency parsing results. Again, this is random sampling. Now the single metric, and then the Bayesian optimization case. Here, the results are less pronounced. And what is interesting, or perhaps the most interesting takeaway, is that in the single case, so the green, yellow, or the result is reversed. So it's now finding from the pool of single examples, finding the best ones is better. And what we also saw is, in contrast to finding the domain per se. So in a way, these domains in here seem to be less dissimilar than in the domain sentiment analysis case. And in fact, what adds to this is if we had all of this data, now in this case, it's quite a bit, but if you train a model on all of the data, in this case, it's actually the best. We are not doing better by selecting less data from this example. Okay, so the idea here was to explore this notion of domain selection, similarity, dissimilarity. And what we found is that using this Bayesian optimization for data selection could help. But what was maybe more interesting even is this analysis of the difference in tasks, right? That the conclusions you can draw from how the single metric even worked across the different tasks. We analyzed even more these weights and how they transfer, and we saw that you can even, learn the weights with another model, with a simpler model. For a more complex model, they transfer also to some degree over domains and tasks. But I'm not going over this here. If you're interested, the code is on GitHub and the paper is on archive as well. But what I want to come to, so this is a bit, 2 years ago that we did this work, or no, 3 years ago by now. But what I want to come to is these results somehow show that these domains also are not so clear-cut, right? That labeling these sets, books, DVD is kind of a little bit of a simplistic assumption, which is an argument in favor of this variety space idea. And in fact, there has been these 2 works recently. One I've talked about really briefly as well. The last one where they used similar ideas for neuro-machine translation. So the third point on the slide. But they used a very, now we have transformers and we can use those as encoders instead of all these handcrafted features that we used back then in this work. And what's very interesting as well is that in these huge transformer models, and they are trained on more and more data, like BERT is trained mostly, multilingual BERT, for instance, is based on Wikipedia data. The question is, how important are these domains? Can we just build this super huge model and we are fine, or do domains still matter? And there was this paper, which is in the middle here, the second point, that shows that these domains are still relevant, even in BERT times, because the closer you have this orange bubble, which is the data the language model is trained on, and you have the target data, which you're interested in, and from that you still only have access to a small data sample. And the closer you can get to this data sample, even in fine-tuning your model, the better you're off. And this, even if you do it in sequence and getting closer and closer to this distribution, you can find a better and better model. And with this, maybe I take a couple of questions right now before going to the next part, if there are any.
So can I ask quickly whether the point you made very briefly there that struck me before, that you hand engineered the features in your work, but today you would do that using something like BERT or transformer features. Have you repeated the experiment to see how much better it is if you use those features on exactly the original work that you did?
No, not yet. That's planned to be done quite soon, actually. But to go back to this work is definitely, because now I have the PhD student who just started 2 weeks ago. But it's very interesting because now we're getting these much more powerful representations, even multilingual representations, and how they now. I would perhaps not go into this Bayesian optimization approach because it's quite an involved wrapper around it. Maybe the work that I've pointed out to used essentially just a simple cosine distance measure for data selection, and found that to be much better than, again, previous work which used language model n-gram-based statistical approaches for data selection. So we kind of, this big jump from static to contextualized embeddings has a big effect, and this has, I think, a big effect also for data selection and finding better ways of finding the best data out there for your task at hand. Does this answer your question?
Yeah.
All right. Right. I don't see any more questions. Or maybe, yeah. Okay, let's go then to the second question. Now we are interested in, we are setting this domain aspect aside, and we are interested in building technology for new languages, because in the end, we would like to have technology that's really, supporting all the languages out there. So how can we build taggers, parsers, or NER systems for those? And in particular, I will talk about, this is really an increasingly attractive topic for people to work on if you just look at the papers that have been published in the ACL ontology in the last period on this. But in particular, I'm interested here in a little case study on Danish. We are interested in finding key entities like person, organization, and locations in text, and there has been work on this, but there was not much data around or any data freely available. So I was interested in, hey, what can we do essentially by transferring from English? There are English resources. How well can we go and do it on Danish? How good are actually Danish NER systems? There were 2 around, but they weren't evaluated. And how quickly can we essentially bootstrap the system by just a little bit of human annotation in the loop? So in fact, we started this by using an annotation budget of just a couple of hours of training, and we added dependency or NER labels to the universal dependency dataset. This is a dataset which exists for parsing, but it hasn't been annotated for NER, and we only did a small subset of this. So we took the development data, which spans around 560 sentences, and the test data, which is of similar size. So around 10,000 tokens are our evaluation data. And then we have a very small budget of training data, like 5,000 tokens and 10,000 tokens, which I call now tiny and small. And so how far can we get with these really just evaluation data to see without any Danish data, plus using this tiny and small data, and how can we essentially use it in a model? And the model here is part of sequence labeler that I've developed, and it's BioSTM back then still with a CRF on top, and it actually uses word embeddings. So the red cat you imagine those are word embeddings and character representations at the lower level. So this has been shown to be very, very helpful for other tasks like part of speech tagging, particularly there when you go to this kind of simplistic morphological representation. And in order now, we have only English data for now. In order to bridge to Danish, one way is to use bilingual or multilingual embeddings. Another way is projecting the annotations, but we didn't do this in this work. That's another study. And so the main idea here is you have English embeddings and Danish embeddings, and you run an alignment algorithm so that you find words which are in similar meanings in the 2 languages closer in this space. And so here we're interested in, okay, first of all, zero-shot learning. How good is, say, an English trained model on this Danish evaluation set? How do we then use this small in Danish training data? So we can do few-shot direct transfer. We can do it in 2 ways, just as an additional training data to English. We can also use it to fine-tune. I will just show the better of the 2, which was simply using them both together as few-shot learning. Exactly, I will not show the few-shot fine-tuning results here. And then compare this actually to not only the zero-shot baseline, but also the baseline of what do you get by just annotating this small set of 200 and 600 Danish sentences, and how quickly does it grow by annotation? So here are the results. We train this BioSTM CRF, and first of all, if you train it on the tiny data, which is these 272 sentences, you get an F score of around 36%. So it's not really great, right? But what you can do is use the static embeddings for Danish, which you can find to boost this performance, and that helps a lot already. In this really low data scenarios where there is not much training data, using these embeddings can help always, essentially. But then, interestingly, now we are jumping from 272 up to 600 sentences. We are getting quite a little bit of boost again, so 11%. So we are up to around 67% already by just training a model on 600 sentences. Now the question is, how good does the English data, how much does the English data help us in boosting this further? So first of all, for zero-shot learning, we are looking here, the orange lines are the in-language trained models, so how good we are with the small data set, which is around 67-ish. And I looked at two ways of transferring. One was the whole of the English data, which is the light blue box, and the other one is a smaller set of English data, the blue box. And what we see here, in fact, is we can add this. The zero shot essentially is already outperforming our little annotation data, the tiny one, the 272, but 600 sentences are still better than this transfer from lots of English data. So this is 14,000 sentences in English, which takes a considerable effort to make, and it doesn't help us so well in, it reaches some baseline around 300 sentences approximately in Danish. But if we now and augment this English data with the tiny or small Danish data, we see that we can boost it quite quickly, quite effectively. We are getting around 71 accuracy. But what's more interesting here is perhaps even that the less data, the medium setup was better than all of the English data. So the medium setup was around, I think, 2,000 sentences instead of 14,000 sentences. And combining that with the small 600 Danish sentences was giving us the best result. So how does this compare now to existing daggers for Danish? There were two out there, and the best turned out to be this polyglot NER system, which is actually trained on automatically derived Wikipedia data. And what we saw, if we compared now our best system trained on the medium English, small Danish data, we saw that we got nice, we are very good in person and organization, but interestingly, locations are still better on the polyglot system. And so the takeaways here are, if you have very little data, that can help you quickly to bootstrap your technology for the language at hand. Embeddings are typically also helping you a lot. But it's interesting, again, this linking to the data that we're using. There is some subset of the data that seems to be better suited for the target task. And I should say this is not fully explored in this paper. This is only, there is more to be done in this area and finding out what is this subset which is better, because we really had just medium and large and not looking more into this setup. Furthermore, there is a couple of more limitations on this work. While it's one of the first that essentially evaluates Danish NERs and provides this data, we are still dealing here with the universal dependencies data that we contributed to earlier, and that has been that's based on the Copenhagen dependency tree bank, and that's rather outdated newswire data. So the domain is not really so great these days. And in addition to that, if we think about how it's annotated, like IT University of Copenhagen is annotated as an organization, but we don't have any finer grained annotation. Like, what about Copenhagen, the location? It's not annotated. It's the bigger entities essentially taken in there, and that's why we recently extended or created a new corpus, or are actually still building this and extending this in future on, we call it Dan Plus. It's a Danish named entity recognition and lexical normalization dataset. And what's nice about it is two things. One is we use nested NER, so we also annotate for like the Copenhagen case. But we also annotated according to a scheme that's derived from a German corpus, where there is also like, Michelin priced eating or Michelin awarded restaurant. Michelin awarded in these data sets wouldn't be annotated because it's an adjective. They really just look for nouns. And this is also annotated in this new data set. Besides that, it spans multiple domains, not just news, but also social media data. And so we have now a data set where we can do cross-lingual experiments but also looking at the out of distribution impact around these domains, which hasn't been done so much so far. And yeah, with this concludes this part of the talk. If I would really like to hear if there are any questions on this part. And I should say I don't see the chat, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to remind everyone that you're welcome to write questions for Barbara in the chat, and we'll read them out to you or ask you to unmute yourself. I don't see any questions in the chat at the moment, however.
Can I ask you a question to relate the first two parts? So it struck me that what you talked about in the first part might be relevant here. So you want to select the part of the English thing to, what is the best selection of the English thing to use in the cross transfer?
Exactly. And that's why I kind of hinted that, you asked me before, and this is again a part where there's more needed, where we hadn't looked at this, but this question of data and how you can select it comes back, and we need to look at this more. We haven't done this as of now, but definitely this is an interesting, that wasn't the main argument or the main thing in the paper. The paper was more about the cross-lingual aspect and benchmarking data, benchmarking Danish NR. So this is a little thing which I would be very interested in exploring next. Yeah, any other questions?
It seems not at the moment.
All right.
Again, I very strongly encourage people to take this opportunity to ask questions. We'll come back to this.
All right. All right, then let's go.
Excuse me, there was a question here. Adam Breitholz, I'm going to unmute you and you can ask this question.
So, hi. I just thought about the test you showed before with the medium dataset outperformed the larger dataset. Was the medium dataset then sort of cross-validated, so you knew that this was sort of, it was always better, no matter what subset of sentences in English you picked? Or is this just...
Okay. That's a good question, and no, this is a weakness of this approach, and this was also a weakness in no. So really, I admit this was in fact not the focus of the paper, but definitely would need a stronger experimental evaluation in this sense there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, it was not the main part of the paper, and this should be looked at more properly. I absolutely agree. Yes. All right. There's no more questions, I guess. All right, and let's go to the last part on multitask learning. I hope you are still with me.
We're still with you. Looking forward to the last part.
All right. So time-wise, yeah. Okay. So now in this last part, here is a tweet by Joaf, who last year essentially was tweeting about BioNLP. So BioNLP is kind of another subfield where he says, we get really crappy scores. So can we do much better on this task, for instance? And at this time, I had a PhD visiting our lab, and he was working on BioNLP. So BioNLP is not my area, but we worked on this together. We were interested, can we actually apply multitask learning to BioNLP in order to help create a better BioNLP event extraction system? And this led, in fact, I'm very happy to say that this led now to the recently accepted EMLP contribution, where we introduced what we call BESL, Biomedical Event Extraction Sequence Labeling. But let me get into the details of this paper in a second. So this is joint work with Alan, Rob van der Groot, Rosario Lombardo, and done by Alan when he visited our lab. So multitask learning is essentially one of the methods that you could use for many things. And why is it interesting? Because now you, instead of focusing on a single task, for instance, or a single language, you can essentially treat and learn a system jointly with multiple tasks at the same time. And why is this interesting is because you can leverage synergies and share parameters also in the model. And a lot of the things today actually are multitask learning, just they are not called this way. For instance, BERT is essentially also a big multitask learning model with multiple objectives, like the masked language model and predicting the next sentence. Yeah, so just to give an example. But here we are interested in looking at specific linguistic tasks and whether we can predict them as auxiliary outputs or auxiliary loss functions in order to help the main task or solve a bigger problem in this case. And this is very attractive because it's very easy also to add, and you see it a lot in NLP use these days. And now here is the task. We are interested in biomedical event extraction. It's a structured prediction task, and it is centered around finding these events. Like here we have an example of an event where there is a trigger, a regulation trigger, which has arguments which are labeled, themes, cause, and it's about finding this structure which it can be nested. So we have entities, but they are participating in these events, and then the goal is to identify the trigger and the whole structure around it, the arguments, where the arguments can be these entities or again other triggers. And one thing to note is typically entities are given in this task. So you know that, for instance, this FOXP3 is a protein, likewise text, and you're trying to find the structure around the entities. Typically, this is solved as a classification task in stages where you first identify the trigger and then build the event structure around this trigger. And what we here did is essentially inspired by work from the dependency parsing literature, which recasted this problem as a sequence labeling problem. We tried to see if we can do something similar in this case, where we essentially encode these structures into a token level representation. So here is an example of, if you look at the yellow box, you see that, for instance, IRF4 is a protein, and it has a link, a theme link to the expression on the right. So we can really try a naive way of now treating or recasting this problem as a sequence label problem, where you predict a label for every token, is to predict this kind of complex label space now, right? In complex label in one go. But we try to think about this is, especially for this domain where there is not much data available, we want to, use multitask learning to also cast it in a way that we have less labels and it's an easier problem to learn. Plus, we can build a model that can do both tasks in one go, the trigger detection and the event detection. And that was the idea. So we are trying to predict this kind of remodeling the problem by encoding these labels, the trees in these labels, and then trying to use multitask learning with there's one more thing that we need to add to get multiple labels for a token and then do the unmerging in the end. So this is how the system looks like a little bit in more detail. We have a sentence, we're getting the entities. So the entities are actually marked in this setup, in this tool. And then we run it through BERT, and now we are using two outputs. One is finding the triggers. So like here is a regulation trigger. And on the other hand, trying to find the edges and the labels for the edges and where they are attached to. And since these structures can actually also be nested, we need to also predict multiple labels. So we are extending the second decoder as a multi-label decoder. And with these together, we can try to then in the end get the events back. So this was the idea, but what we saw essentially is that this is really helping a lot. So if you compare to the best system released in EMLP 2019, which was back then three LSTM based, but had even a knowledge source in addition, we could get a big boost in the state of the art. But of course, now it's interesting to know, hey, what's going on in the system? What is contributing to this to make it so performant? So in fact, we in the end got this 65% F1 score. The previous state of the art was below 60. But what we saw is, okay, you can see on one side the multitask approach, but also the multi-label approach and how important are they. So if we remove multitask learning and learn this complex label space in one go, then we lose 1.5%. But what was more important is we lose even more if we don't treat these multi-label cases, which means in the data there's nested events that we need to capture. There are not that many, I don't now remember exactly the numbers, but we need to capture them in order to get the best performance out. And one thing to note in this work is all of the previous work relies on these gold entities, right? Now here activation is a trigger, and you know where the entities are. You do not give the entity identity, so do not give away too much or learn to rely very heavily on the word itself, but you know where it is. So we were interested also, how good does this perform when we don't have any gold information? So how well would this do if you would apply it on real data out in the world? And so we train the same system as a sequence labeler and predict with this BERT model entities and feed this in, and we see that you would lose around 6% if you go to this setup where we don't have this gold entity information. Right, and now the other question is how fast is this, right? Because now we are replacing this staged system with a system which is clear end to end, and we could compare it to the second best performing system, which is TEAS, since that had the code available, and we saw that Beazley is substantially better. Like if we train it compared to the single system, it's twice as fast approximately, and it's the ensemble even more, but the fair comparison is maybe the single system. And with this, I come to the last part, but I don't have apparently much time left. Let me just say one more very quick tour on an application of multitask learning and where it is interesting for, yeah, okay, but there's a hand actually. Simon?
Yes, hello.
Hi. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have a question to this last part, this bio-NLP. This is not an area which I'm intimately familiar with, but there's a lot of complementary representations of the same data, right? So the data often that is encoded into these into these sentences that are, I guess, literature data from academic articles, for instance. That's also often encoded into databases of networks that describe causal relationships between biological entities. Do you see that so is there maybe a way of sort of cross-checking or using these representations that you get, that you learn to cross-check the inferences that you make from the text data with such a database? Do you see this as an opportunity?
Yeah, because in the end, the end goal of this extraction task is to populate these knowledge bases, but maybe there is, I'm not so familiar with it as well. Is that a structure, a network of article level, not at the word level, what you were referring to? Or can you give...
So what I'm referring to is sort of like these efforts that are in systems biology, where researchers try to aggregate this information that is in the literature into databases that are essentially relationships between biological entities.
Yeah.
So as I understand it, what the aim of what you want to do is essentially contribute to automating this task, right?
Exactly. Yeah,
right.
And making it better. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. So my question is that whether you can somehow encode, for instance, if there's prior knowledge, like there is already a base of knowledge, you can encode this somehow in the way that you extract information, because some statements might be conflicting with each other in the literature, that some researchers under certain conditions find one thing to happen and under other conditions something else to happen. So how do you, and often this is, for instance, in the context of broader like perturbations of the systems that are not maybe well described or covered in the short-term memory that is in these learning systems?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because ultimately the system can help and automate this, exactly. But the system doesn't know, beyond the training data, doesn't use any other data, right? So your question perhaps links a little bit back to the previous work by Lee et al., because they inflated a knowledge base into the LSTM structure and into guiding the tree LSTM approach. So certainly there are opportunities here to enrich this model with kind of a knowledge-based driven approach on the one side, right? To feed it back, but also to kind of maybe even constrain it in a way on the predictions if you would use this knowledge base in a more combining it more with a symbolic approach essentially. And I think this would be very interesting, and there is, as of now, there is an area or work in this direction with using knowledge bases or symbolic representations in neural NLP models, but there's way too little. So we have done something on post tagging using lexicons and to improve post tagging, for instance. It's kind of an also, but then really going beyond just improving the system to using it in the loop with the end user and with the extraction knowledge base, right? That would be interesting to kind of close this loop, perhaps. I hope this answers the question. It's a great question. I hope, yeah. Okay, I don't know, the time is actually up. I'm sorry for this. I have one last thing I want to just show you here. This is work with people from University of Copenhagen and University of Amsterdam. And what we looked at is visual question answering. And we were interested on using multitask learning to essentially improve a previous system, which essentially you have a guesser which tries, in this game, you're trying to predict where the object is that the agent has in mind by asking questions. And previous work was essentially detaching the guesser from the agent module that asked the questions. So we thought, okay, we can actually improve this by having a visually grounded dialogue state where both the guesser and the generator of the questions are linked to each other. And we found that that helps, but maybe the most interesting thing, I don't have time to go into here, is we looked at, so this was this DSAL CL system in the end, but we compared it to a reinforcement learning system. They got similar results, but the thing is to look beyond this task accuracy scores on what are the dialects, these two systems which are close in the accuracy scores. How do they compare on a output level? What do they generate? And we looked at, looking at the questions they generate, how often are they repeated? And we found that our system was closer in the sense to the humans, that it was more varied, versus the reinforcement learning system was a lot on repeating, or focusing on locations. So in this table here, you can see that the human is the last one, and the reinforcement learning, if you analyze the types of questions asked, it focused a lot about properties, attributes, and especially location type of questions, versus the system we trained was a little bit more varied, but there's a lot to be done to be getting even closer to human performance. So the takeaway from this thing was MTL can help also there, but we should really go more to look at beyond the numbers that we are getting, to understand in one way where the data, what we give the system, how that works, but in the other way also the results that we are getting in the end. And this is kind of closing my circle, and there's lots of areas to work on in future to improve it. But yeah, to wrap up, I tried to give you a flavor of what I'm doing in this space, zooming into these 3 areas here, and just 3 takeaways. This notion of domain and how data varies is super interesting, and looking more at the data selection is something I think there's a lot to be done still in both cross-domain and cross-lingual learning setups. We can get better models by joint learning and grounding to explore synergies and scale up technology. But at the same time, while it gives us flexibility, there is more to be discovered on how to share, when to share, and also if the data is not coming in at the same time, if you have a setup where you have tasks coming in at hand, how can you learn over time, or how can you learn continually in a way. And this ends my talk. I'm sorry that I had to rush now in the end. I would really like to thank my collaborators and the people in my lab, and I would also like to thank you here for this opportunity to give this talk. And if there's still time for questions, I'm happy to take some questions. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Barbara, and we can give you a virtual claps. So that would have been much louder if you were here in person. So, thanks for the fantastic talk. And we still have people who are staying on after the time, which is good because, like me, they're probably interested in continuing. If you have the time, those of us who can remain are free to come and to put forward the last bunch of questions to Barbara. So we are open for questions from those of you who want to continue to stay here for a bit longer. The others who may have other things to do, of course, you're free to leave, but we are still welcoming questions from people. So there are many people thanking you on the chat, but let's see if there's somebody who wants to ask a question. Okay, so Frederick, maybe.
I'll just start. So thank you, Barbara, for the great talk. I was curious about the last part about the multitask learning. So in some contexts, we expect multitask learning to work really well, but in other contexts, we might expect the different tasks to interfere. Did you see anything like that? Was it difficult to balance the different objectives that you're optimizing with the respective sort of heads of the networks, or did you observe anything like that in your experience?
Yes. That's a very good question. In fact, the balancing is very important, especially now in this latest BERT model. We really have to, like the paper I didn't touch on, the Danish DAN plus corpus. We use BERT for modeling, and it was really important or in general in this model to balance the data. There is methods like you can do proportional sampling to kind of balance the data to make it, especially like if you work with the glue data where one data set has like a huge so it's influencing the bigger one to a large extent, and then balancing it in this way. And others, there's more work to be done. More work in this area can help you tremendously. I didn't touch up on the side effects. So on the not so good side of multitask learning, there is in fact lots of cases where you don't see any improvement. It's not said that this will definitely help you, and finding out when this is the case is also still an area where there hasn't been done so much. We had some little work on this a bit earlier on looking at a priori at the label distribution and how similar even are the label distribution, how many labels you have, how peaky are they, or how flat are they? And this can give you some indication of how close they are. Johannes had looked at also in things like cross entropy to relate it to the instance space, which is also very helpful. And people in Copenhagen also, and Anders, for instance, they looked at the not just a priori measures like we did, but looking at the learning of the auxiliary tasks, how quickly this plateaus. And these are all indications of whether it's helpful, but still a lot, often it's an empirical question in the end. But if you have a good intuition, it's sometimes even somehow counterintuitive why it doesn't work. So yeah, there is more to be done in this.
Thank you so much for the answer. We have a question also from Emil. I'm going to ask him to unmute himself and ask the question.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much for this great talk. I recently read your Guess What paper, actually, and I wonder if you have any intuition why the RL focus on only a few things, such as location. Is it like due to some exploration, or
yeah, this is no. Why? That was the. This is very difficult to say. Why? We saw it. We just did the post hoc analysis of what's happening to get a better understanding. But why would you have any intuition on? I mean, it's in one maybe intuition. Sometimes it's kind of. But this I would need to go back and check the data properties. How often kind of location would be easy to guess, right? So that there seems to be some kind of, that would be actually maybe an interesting, I don't remember if you did it, like how often an attribute would lead to the correct analysis, and whether it's just a frequency, that it's kind of the most efficient way of solving this task. You don't need to be smart, you just need to have a good strategy. And this seems to be a good strategy to do, although it's not, yeah, that's kind of the intuition I have here. So the other model is more varied and can go to more corner cases, but it seems to be, yeah, maybe.
So can I just jump in with a quick one? I took the liberty of just unmuting myself. So, I like this idea that you had in the beginning of, of a more fine-grained representation of the variability, and not just like discrete domains like social media and biology and so on. But have you ever developed any model or seen anyone else developing a model that tries to model the variability of language inside of the actual learning?
No, not much yet. It's only happening now a bit.
It's just a conceptual idea that you have right
now?
Yeah,
yeah. This is a conceptual idea that I haven't yet implemented and brought to, but this is part of the grant I've gotten, and so that's coming up. So this PhD student who started now will work on cross-domain, cross-lingual parsing, and we just started to look now at you know, what can we find even in the data, and starting, but it's really in the beginning. So it would be very interesting to connect this to ideas from instance importance weighting, going back to that literature, or even, you know, going to curriculum learning setups. But there is one hint, one difficult part, and that's the evaluation, right? Because at the evaluation time, we often don't have like more than a data set label. So how do we evaluate it then in a good way, these continuous representations? And maybe this is even a bigger problem than you know, looking at the input axis, but not at the Y's so much, and how they can change. So ideally, we would go to even, you know, learning under uncertainty and learning under, you know, human labeling, and even there it's not the same, not so, but that goes now too far off the topic what you actually asked me.
Thanks.
Morteza has a question. I'm going to find him and ask him to unmute as well. Please go ahead, Morteza.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you for this presentation. Hi. I'm Morteza Cherdekani. I have a question about this Bayesian optimization. So based on what I understood, if it's correct, so you define the kernel in kind of non-parametric way. So like based on different ways that you define similarity metrics. So I was wondering if you can define it in some kind of parametric way, where you can induce some parameters, and then when you tune these parameters, then one maybe can get better kernel and then do this Bayesian optimization better. Like that kind of a way that it is better adapted to different kind of settings or contexts that you have studied. Because if I remember, like for different kind of contexts that you have done these experiments, the results were different among different choices. So maybe then one can learn this kind of similarity or kernel to be kind of universal or adapt to the specific task that you kind of consider or you study. And then by learning this kernel, one can get better results for this Bayesian optimization.
This is a very interesting idea. Yeah, I agree. Are you thinking like even going to like parameterizing the like a variational autoencoder or something like yes. That in the yeah, okay. And then even going one step further, and you would put it on like in a hierarchical way and learning over the family of different tasks. Yeah, that sounds no, I haven't done anything, but this sounds like a very good idea to look into. Yeah, and connect to the selection of Bayesian optimization instead of this. Yeah, as you say, now we are creating the features, but they are not. No, there is no generator, no parametric function behind those. Would be very interesting. Thanks for this great question.
You're welcome. Just maybe also one other way also to see this thing is to even just to combine different ways of doing this kind of comparing this kind of similarities and so on. It can be a bit like a kind of ensemble methods. Instead of just having one kind of similarity and so on, one can think of maybe combining them like in hierarchical way or in the context of ensemble methods and this kind of things.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Even maybe without the optimization step a priori. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
exactly.
I agree.
So just that combining them without
that would be interesting. Yeah, and cheaper, much cheaper to do.
Exactly.
So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Great.
Thank you, Morteza. I don't see any more questions in the chat. I have one more for you though, Barbara, which is sort of on a different level, as it were. I don't know what your situation is exactly, but what I know about your field or NLP in general is that it has attracted a lot of interest from industry, and that means that a lot of developments recently that have attracted sort of more, I don't know, public attention has a lot of funding behind it and a lot of computer power and a lot of these things that we don't always have access to in academia. How do you think about these things? And
Thanks, Frederick, for this great question. This is a worry and a luxury at the same time, right? So yeah, or happy. I have a happy and a sad answer to this, right? So on the one hand, we are really progressing the field by having these large models and that the big companies make them available. On the other hand, I'm struggling as even to get the GPUs for my students and then we don't have access to these machines, GPUs and everything that other other have. In the long run, I hope we are able to create communities that we can share the resources and get access. Everyone gets access. That would be my hope. Because what I see often now is that colleagues go and have a secondary appointment, maybe in an industry, because then they can ask these questions which we can simply not ask at the moment. And I think even a lot of these questions I would be interested in here if these data sets, so LNAI, sorry, is really interested in this paper that I mentioned. They are looking at these questions. And so ideally, so in my ideal world, people would get access and we build networks so that we can share resources and share insights and even access to power, because we need to work together to have a more diversified field in many aspects, and computational access is one of them, which is super important. And yeah, I'm really also supporting building up these communities and systems.
Thank you. I see in chat that Devlet has a general provocative question. I'm curious what that is.
Go ahead.
Okay, so this is going back to one of your very first slides when you had these pictures of, was it, what's her name, the science fiction?
The Ex Machina.
Ex Machina, that's right. So the question is, I mean, these days, there's been a lot of hullabaloo about GPT-3 and all the amazing things it can do, and some people have, I think some people who might even be here listening at the moment thought of that as an example of the first step towards artificial general intelligence. So I was wondering what your thoughts are about on a technology like GPT-3. Does it, for you, I mean, what do you think of it? Is it a step towards artificial general intelligence, or what is it as a language technology?
Yeah, that's a very good question. On the ones, so I'm actually more in the bootcamp of if you know or have read the thing by Emily and Alexander Koller, that we are learning. We are not still learning understanding. These models are getting better and better and trained on more data, but they're still limited. So to the data we are using and to what we can ask them to do. So GPT-3 is certainly amazing in the sense that what people now observe in using it and how it reacts. But intelligence, I think we are still far from an ex machina where, it's not just about understanding even, but it's about including the context around it, and you know, these social things that we as humans even have when we interact, which now it's even hard, right? I can't see you all, so there is a lot of additional signals that we can get from around the text, not even the text signal. And this is another dimension I'm very, very interested in, how to go beyond it to make towards more intelligent systems. I think Ex Machina is trained on text. It's good. It's very good. It pushes results. But intelligence is something where we still have a far path ahead to really get into that. But what I would call closely to intelligence. But yeah, this is my view. I would really love to hear others what you think on this. Maybe even Devtat, what you believe, or what's your take on this?
Well, I agree completely with you.
And like, if you look at Ex Machina, there's even emotions and people falling in love with a machine, right? So could anyone fall in love with GPT-3? I doubt that. So maybe that's a good test in knowing whether it's really intelligent. But this is just like a bit of a crazy idea.
I like it. So we don't have any more questions in chat at the moment. This is, I guess, the last chance to ask one.
It's great to see some names that I recognize. So greetings to Bafia, Simon, for instance.
Okay,
right.
I think we'll take this as the opportunity to thank you once more, Barbara. It was a great talk, and I think a lot of people are interested in what you had to say, so that was very nice to have you over. And I'll just make one very short announcement before we conclude, which is that there will be an AI talk coming up in 2 weeks by Arthur Gretton, and he will be talking about GANs and how we can train them in a way that makes sense. So hopefully all of you will join us then. And until next time, thank you, and I'll see you then.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation.